Welcome to the PsychoAcoustics panel. I'm Terry Patten. I'm the president of Tools for Exploration, and I am also the director of Neuroacoustic Laboratories. We've produced some psychoacoustic audio recordings. And I'm joined by a wonderful panel of speakers who will be introducing themselves as they begin. Each of us will be speaking for 10 or 15 minutes, and at the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity for questions. In order to give everybody a starting point for the panel, I want to offer a definition of psychoacoustics. Very simple. Psychoacoustics is the use of sound to influence consciousness, primarily sound that we hear, particular sounds. And the goals and benefits of psychoacoustic technologies are to alter consciousness. Sometimes this has been done successfully and measured through EEG measurements and measures of relaxation like breath rate, galvanic skin resistance, and fingertip temperature. These are modalities that can objectively measure our states. Psychoacoustics is primarily scientific. In contrast to some of the things that are done in music therapy, there's really an attempt here to create a science. Clearly, though, most of the people who are working in psychoacoustics are working intuitively, not just scientifically. So there's a combination of an art and a science in the whole field of psychoacoustics. Now, the vocabulary of psychoacoustics is vast, and everybody in the field is innovating constantly, but I think it's useful to point out a few of the most important techniques that are actively used in the field right now, one of which is binaural beats. And binaural beat frequencies are usually sine wave tones which are played in the left and right channels of a recording and offset by a specific frequency. For instance, you might be hearing 300 cycles per second in your left ear and 308 cycles per second in your right ear. When this is done, there's a phantom beat at 8 cycles per second that your brain hears as though it were there, even though there's no 8 cycle per second signal actually being delivered. And this phantom binaural beat has been measured in some studies to produce a heightened level of right and left synchronous 8 cycle activity in people's brains. These binaural beats are usually used at certain window frequencies. Window frequencies are brainwave frequencies that have been associated with specific and desirable brain states. So these window frequency binaural beats are frequently played over one another because there is no such thing as a simple 8 cycle per second brain state. Everybody has a complex pattern of brain activity at any given moment, and frequently there are psychoacoustic audio recordings that are stimulating multiple frequencies at the same time. And there are now people who are doing recordings where an entire piece of music is phase shifted left and right with corrections so that it doesn't get out of sync, but you have a changing pattern, not just a sine wave tone, which is offset by a specific frequency left and right. And that is thought to create some of these same benefits that have been associated with the binaural beats, but I don't think these have been quite as rigorously researched or measured. And there are also the use of clicks, which are just patterns of stimulation that are very neutral and frequently don't even sound very pleasant, but which will stimulate brain activity. For instance, if something is clicking 6 times per second, you can measure brain activity that's increased at 6 cycles per second. It's not terribly evocative experience, but it does seem to create some effects on people, and some people who are experimenting with psychoacoustics do use that technique. Other interesting techniques go on from there, though. There's people who are inspired by the work of Dr. Cymatics have enhanced frequencies that correspond to those that he feels charge the brain, generally those above 2,000 cycles a second. And so this is another entirely independent technique for creating changes in consciousness with recordings. Other people are experimenting with placing sounds in 3D space using advanced microphone systems that give you a sense of space, not just sweeping in front and around you, left to right and behind, but also up and down. And there are, by using that kind of a technique, you can place a sound at a chakra specifically, or you can place a sound out in space. And any of you familiar with NLP know that we do internal processing. Certain kinds of internal processing are associated with eye movements, up and to the left or down and to the right. Well, you can place a sound in that part of your own psychophysical space through 3D recordings. Now, one of the most interesting areas is using specific note patterns. Descending tones, thirds or fifths, are thought by some people to produce specific effects if they're done in certain rhythms. Soothing tones and textures that produce one kind of effect. Something very slow and languorous over a rhythmic but gentle percussion track will create another interesting state of consciousness. So there are people who are actually doing research, repetitively playing certain patterns of music or melody and measuring effects on people's breathing rhythms or galvanic skin resistance. People are working intuitively and scientifically, and these different faculties of innovation are each very important in this field and kind of rivaling one another. It seems to me that some of the most important creative work has really just proceeded intuitively, but psychoacoustics does sound scientific, and the intention is to do something that's really valid and measurable. So there's an attempt here to actually measure the effects and produce reliable observations that are principles for a field. One of the most exciting ways that psychoacoustics become felt is through delivery systems. Really, the whole field was created after we had headphones and we could have complete right-left separation, and we could play with the effects of our right and left hemispheres, our right and left ears. But beyond that, a very important innovation that we're going to see quite a bit of in this panel is the sound table, where your whole body is vibrated with sound. And we have two sound tables here, and people who work clinically with sound tables, which deliver sound to the human body very powerfully in ways that really haven't been possible before. And we'll hear about the effects that those have in clinical settings, too.
My name's Chuck Wilson, and what I'd like you to do before I introduce myself is just sit comfortably, those of you already sitting, or stand comfortably, if you will, and take a deep breath. And just, allow yourself to center and close your eyes for a moment. What you just experienced was a combination of technologies, psychoacoustics, if you will, from very ancient times, inclusive of a set of Tibetan bells or dingshas that have binaural frequencies in them. We talk about binaural frequencies and sometimes refer them as to being a new technology. However, the binaural oscillations are what's called it's a combination of constructive and destructive interference patterns or frequency interference modulation. There's different terms for it. But these have been used for quite some time. In combination with the technology, that's the binaural signal generator that actually was developed by the Monroe Institute and Bob Monroe. Myself, I'm a former trainer for the Gateway program, the Gateway Outreach program for the Monroe Institute, and have a lot of respect for their technology. Additionally, we have some friends of ours, some cetaceans, mammals of the sea, who contributed to that little acoustical exploration. And my background includes being a musician, professional musician since the age of 17, and getting involved in music and sound and how it affected my body and myself through sound. My function now, if you will, as a human being, is to use sound and vibration to realize and uncover my own blockages, facilitate others' blockages, to open and to realize their selves, their wholeness, their true vision and self through sound and vibration. Through that, I've come to be known for sound tables. Most recently, primarily right now, I'm the president of a company called Discovery Sound. Discovery Sound's function is to produce sound tables and other devices that are conveyors of sound directly to the body. Briefly, a sound table is a device, is often a massage table, or in our case, we're really known for our water-based system. It's a water table or a water bed surrounded by an air ring to support the water, or sometimes a frame. And underneath that is either a set of transducers or speakers. Now, speakers are transducers in essence. They're air transducers versus electromechanical transducers. A speaker will actually take the electrical energy from the amplifier that you have and transfer it through a voice coil into mechanical energy and actually move the cone of the speaker. And in the case of the Somatron here, there are speakers here, and the speakers act as a vehicle for the air movement to utilize the top of this massage table as a sounding board, much like the guitar is a sounding board. With this particular table that I have, this is one of our tables, a little different. It uses actual electrical mechanical transducer. The electrical mechanical transducer doesn't have that cone, doesn't have a speaker cone. It attaches directly to the surface of the table, so the table becomes the cone, if you will, or the speaker. So we feel there's less of an impedance loss or less of a loss because you're directly transferring the sound to the body. In addition, using a water-based systems, there's several water-based systems out. Our Discovery system, there's a Vibrasound system, there's one called the Rest Rider, another one called the Alternator. There's about 7 or 8 people around the country and around the world who are producing equipment like this. It sort of came in through the matrix of information, and we all sort of got it at the same time, if you will, and are working as vehicles or vessels for this technology. And the water-based system even better conveys sound to the body. The reason being, we're primarily water. And water, sound actually travels faster through water. Sound travels at different speeds through different mediums. You can probably remember from some of the old westerns where someone's trying to tell the train if the train's coming. And they listen, they don't hear anything, so they put their head down to the rail and listen on the rail, and they can hear the sound because it travels faster through the rail than it does through the air. Likewise, with water and with water systems, the sound will travel a little more uniformly. There's less distortion, et cetera, et cetera. The way we design this type of equipment, we use products called accelerometers. They're similar to microphones, with the exception that you can put these accelerometers on the surface of a body, of a table, and actually take measurements of the frequency spectrum, the audio frequency spectrum, so you can see what is actually going on with the table itself. Am I playing a pure tone, or am I playing some type of tone that has differential harmonics in it? So that's what a sound table is. My main work has been really to work with sound tables with, maybe we can take the screen down for a moment, and I can briefly talk about that. Yes. I'm just going to briefly leave you with a couple things that really drive my intention for this company and what I do. And that includes that we, as human beings, or vehicles at this point for our intention, consist of vibration and sound. Sound and vibration can be represented in our DNA or our molecular structure. That sound can be represented through EEG patterns, or the nice patterns through the 24-channel monitor, the LexCore monitor that Skip showed you, or our voice pattern. My voice pattern is me. It's my signature. These are all particular vibratory patterns that can be measured if we want to actually look at that. So we have a pattern. We are a pattern. We manifest ourselves on this planet as a pattern. Therefore, we can have relationship where we have an event or person interacting with us, and we can have, in very simple terms, what's called a constructive interference pattern. And in that case, it's a pattern where I have my frequency, and something comes in line with it that directly matches it, completely constructive interference, which in effect will generate a synergistic pattern, or a pattern that's much bigger but uniform, very similar. So that would be a constructive interference. So that's an event or a person coming into your space with constructive interference. You then have another directly opposite, and I'm talking in broad terms again, of destructive interference. Destructive interference being where the form is directly opposite. The end result being a line, silence, the absence of. And with that are the fine-tunings in between. Binaural frequencies actually are the constructive and destructive slightly off. So you start together and you come off, so that you get that wave oscillation every 6th tone, or every 10th second, or every 8th second, or something of that nature. Again, these are simplified versions of what's occurring, but it's a nice example. I like to think of ourselves as being the frequency and the reflection thereof of these patterns, and our life just being the interaction thereof. Using sound in that manner, sound as a vehicle or as a model for the bigger model of the macrocosm of us, we've been building tables and actually looking towards practitioners like yourselves and other people, to scientists, etc., to utilize this equipment in ways that play sound to the body, that work with sound toning within the body, and actually finding out the effects of this. So really, it's in a very experimental stage. This is hardware, and we're really looking for software. We're looking for the program development. So over the next couple of years, I'm very excited about what's going to occur with the program development around this. So that's sort of a brief description. Thank you very much, Terry. Sure.
I'm Don Campbell, and I'm the director of the Institute of Music, Health, and Education in Boulder. And 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I had the wonderful honor of being with Dr. Arthur Harvey, who I hope all of you will meet. He was the first to bring this kind of conclave together of intuitive healers, music therapists, professional musicians at Eastern Kentucky University. And many of us are just meeting again after those 5 or 6 years. And at that time, we were in the prenatal state of conception. Conception, what is the thought, what is it that we're talking about in sound and acoustics that affects health? And I've already seen from just this morning and last night what a quantum leap we are sensing because of what's been written, what's been researched, and if anything, our questions have greatly changed. We have a different way to focus, and we have a different world view of the potentials of sound. A few things I want to bring out is, starting as a musician and as a performing musician as well as a classically trained ear, I've always wanted to know what is it within sound that, within the acoustics of sound, that allows me to feel full. And as we talk about health, I'm very clear that the definition of health for me is not to get well. I'm very, very clear about this. Healing, if you look at the ancient Greek definitions, means balance and harmony with what is happening in the mind, the body, the heart, and the spirit. And curation is a byproduct. And that curation and medicine define things in different ways than healing. Because here we're dealing with the integration of spirit and well-being as well as physical work. And I worked in a hospital in Haiti for 6 months for TB patients. And this was in 1969. And something very interesting happened. There were 500 patients in one hospital, one nurse and a bottle of aspirin. And in some of the most remarkable ways, I saw healing there, but I had no language for it. I saw death everywhere, but I saw human spirit and spirituality. I was working with a Christian missionary society at that time. Many years later, I met Dr. Motoyama in Tokyo and worked with him for a few years. I was living there for 7 years, and he started using sound generators and different kinds of sounds, and people would come out modified. And I think that's one thing that we know, that consciousness changes. Altered states of consciousness is our normal, everyday routine. What is impossible is to get consciousness not to alter long enough that we can modify encoded patterns in such a large framework. So, I mean, to get a phenomena is the easy thing. To stabilize a phenomena, prolong it, and repattern mind-body relationship is altogether new. And this is what I'm sensing happening with the somatron and so forth. Dr. Tomatis, I'm not a Tomatis method person. But I am a Tomatis devotee because I feel like he's asking the most intelligent questions of how we are put together. And I think his questioning procedure is extremely interesting. And I bought a Somatron, and I've remodeled it 3 times, and the company has remodeled it so that it has 16 speakers, and it's completely divided between the left side and the right side, and I have a 32-channel equalizer by which we use the table after the effect, never before the effect. And what the effect is we give audiograms so we know what sounds are able to enter your body through bone conduction and air conduction. And this morning there was a little graph up there for 12 seconds that you perceived unconsciously. But as we learn about how we receive sound, then we have, I sense, an ethical choice of what parts of the sound is appropriate to stimulate, because there are no 2 people in this room who have the same ear on the left side or the right side. And this deals with bone conduction and skin conduction. And to briefly put this into a package that perhaps will be understandable, is I'm looking at the energy inside of sound rather than the sound itself. And looking at the device by which sound is received in brain, body, emotions, heart, or whatever framework that we have. I think it's very, very dangerous in this day and age to try to transfer systems. The medical community many times is quite alien because the chakra system is not proven nor in their language base. I don't think either person is wrong. I think we have to all develop listening languages to feel the wisdom in what they're saying clinically, and simultaneously develop the wisdom for those of us who come a mystical tradition to not be afraid to language it and not realize we're giving up our heart by speaking in clinical and behavioral terms at times. And I think what we're calling forth here is new languaging that's safe for our mind, body, heart, and not get stuck in old systems of behavioral clinical techniques or old systems of ancient metaphysical techniques. Now, that's quite a personal view, but that seems to be what my dealing inside of myself all the time. How can I find a proper language where we can truly sit as a colloquium, as a consortium between our left and right conscious brains? And that's far more interesting than saying what the other group is not doing. Now, I'm going to put on a tape right now This is what excited me quite a bit in beginning this work, is realizing what happens in the auditory nerve between 10th and 16th week after conception. That in utero, the auditory nerve, 8th cranial, is the first to receive sound, and that patterning exists all the way until about 10 days after birth. Go ahead and put that on and turn it up, please. You may have to rewind it if we're missing something. So that we know how the brain is stimulated in utero. And the sounds in utero, as the development of the cochlea and other framework of the brain at that time, it is only able to decipher very, very, very high frequencies. And I'll use this to make the... And we note that it is the... In other words, it's that high. Have we got that yet? The high part of the sound. That in utero we are picking up in different linguistic forms. This is Dr. Tomata speaking.
Qui sont ceux de la digestion. Sound of our mother's digestion. Au-dessus ce rythme, la respiration. Rhythm of her breathing. Sorte de fluide kind of le bruit de la mer. Like the sound of the sea. Le bruit de la vague qui avance, qui souffle. On a l'impression d'être sur le rivage. We're on a shore. Puis peu à peu se dessine.
But this is not what's heard by the utero, by the fetus. This is the surrounding sounds. Remember, they're always underwater. They're never acoustic like we know it. And this is the charging of the brain sound that's beginning right now.
These are the primitive rhythms which shape our whole existence. Ils vont rester ceux de nos déterminismes premiers. Ceux de nos balances. They will be the rhythms of our balance, of walking, ceux de nos peurs, dancing, also of the fears which will haunt our nights.
Now, this is not heard. It's only felt through water to this point.
Hear a faint sound from inside, a little strident. Une transmission fausse. It's a high frequency, much higher than the others. It takes effort for us to hear it. It's the sound of the voice, the mother's voice.
Now, from that, Dr. Tomatis has gone through, he goes through a process of nearly 200 hours of a sonic rebirth. Now, what interests me about this, and on Monday we'll have a whole hour and a half really explaining what this means to the auditory and physical systems. What is interesting to me is until we have had these electronic devices, we've only had a natural device. And so my question has always gone back, even though I use the table and the electronic ear and other devices, and I've experimented, what we're finding is what can the natural voice do? And how do we modify the voice through the ears, because they're so different. So the majority of our work, Joshua, would you stand for just a second, since you've done this? We have a year-long therapeutic sound school, and Joshua's a student in Colorado, and then we have another one in Pennsylvania that starts next week. It's a year-long program. Start with a scan, like we usually do. Now, literally, John Cardwell, who's my assistant, who's always here, you had an audiogram with John. We call it a listening voice-ear assessment. They'll take that assessment, and we'll be able to see what's happening in the body. Dr. Cymatics literally can give the history of the body, the mother relationship, the father relationship, as the ways the right ear and the left ear receives information. And this is really the right and left brains, the linguistic codings. And by making a suggestion to your posture or through a thought, since we did a last treatment on you, you've done some work. And we put self-generated tones always into the body, so that you are your own acoustical system. And 4 or 5 days at a time, for 10 minutes a day of a tone that you produce on your own body seems to bring about an enormous leap and advance in the way we integrate these systems. In conclusion, the only other thing is I'm very associated with the Sound Lab at the University of Colorado, and here we have an extraordinary whole room this size where the whole floor is a speaker, and we're able to train deaf children, and we have all the auditory, we have, like the laser you saw this morning for every sound, we have a big television screen that shows what's happening in the frequency range as you speak, as well as large tubes that emit the colors. So a deaf student, there's no such thing as absolute deafness through the bone conduction and the ear conduction. And the more energy we're able to find through self-generated tones, amplified by these other types of music, they're orchestrated. So 1 second here is one piece of music. The goal is this: how do we create these transformations using the beauty of music at all times, and let beauty hold its wisdom? What is it within Mozart, what is in Bach? And this is 30 seconds of a piece that I call Contradance. 2 completely different pieces of music, individual, in different rhythms, in different, they're in the same key. And when you listen to them bilaterally, it orchestrates something quite different than just the sounds themselves. So if you listen closely. One's in 3, one's in 4. But when you listen to them together, you feel something in them. Okay, so that's by the use of this kind of music and looking for greater art in the midst of all the technical new things, my idea is that the spirit can dance through beauty once again and heal as we come and interface this way. So,
Great. I tried to save a little time at the end for questions. It is only a little time, I guess, but please feel free to ask a question of anyone in particular, and I guess I'll... I
have one of Mr. Atwater about the Monroe work. Do you ever have the self-generated, people that come into the sound isolation booth, do self-generated sound and then test the change, or is it always inputting some sort of sound?
We never have done that. The person in the booth does hear themselves speak, but what I have obviously been learning in the last few days is we generate guidance over the tapes in terms of imagery or suggested exercises that it would be very interesting for us to be able to understand the technology that Don has been talking about and the Cymatics people have been talking about, so that the language of the tapes were chosen specifically for different kinds of exercises based on their upbringing. And the idea of doing self-generated sound is done through a process that we have a series called the Mind's Eye series, where you record your own voice and then we add hemisync to the background of that. I want to plug a friend of mine's book while I've got the microphone. I've been in this business all my life and professionally now for the last 15 years, and I've seen lots and lots and lots of things happen. I've had lots of experiences myself. I channel myself. And it really takes something spectacular for me to see something that really impresses me. And I have a friend whose name is Joe McMonagle who really impresses me. He's one of the best remote viewers in the entire world, been tested in many laboratories. And he has just published a book called Mind Trek. And I promised him that I would mention it up here because he has impressed me for the last 15 years. It's a name of what the ancient term might be clairvoyance, a person who's able to see things happen at distance. Mind Trek, like Star Trek, but down up here, Mind Trek.
Can you get that in any bookstore?
You can get it from Hampton Roads, and it'll be in B. Dalton and the other stores next week. I imagine it's in shipping as we go.
This is a question for Don. Does the Institute provide any sort of training for teachers who work with learning disabled?
We're a multiple personality of survival, and we live through what is requested. There are training seminars. I've written 2 books on education. Rhythms of Learning is a very thorough book on mind development that is adaptable. There's also another book that's very easy, 100 Ways to Improve Teaching with Your Voice and Music. They're both in Zephyr Press. In the other 2 books, Music and Miracles, as well as Music Physician for Times to Come. There are 50 articles by cutting-edge leaders in the field on different forms of learning disabilities. And the work with Tomatis in Music Physician and Music and Miracles are, one of them is clinical stories and projected philosophy, and the other is personal stories as we learn to explain it. So those 2 books are companions in that way. There are 3- and 4-day programs. We have handouts for everybody. We have a whole table over there, and there's a list of that work. Mostly what we're doing is year-long training programs that is now going to go into 2-year training in Philadelphia. Next year it'll be in California, so that there'll be 3 schools. And then we run a correspondence course for people all over the country just on tone and the voice, all self-generated work. And you do it independently. It's rigorous and it's very boring. It bores right into you, you know, I mean, because when you face that vibration, you are impeccably awake or asleep, and so it's in consciousness. So. Ginger Clarkson also teaches this, and she's here. You'll hear her later, and she is in this area who does training in that.
While we're doing little plugs, one of the things about education as well, we just recently developed a program called the Sound and Music Practitioner program, which includes how to utilize devices, some of these devices, sound tables and other tools, which actually work hand in hand with some of the programs that Don's been doing throughout all these years. And ours is a 100-hour program that's primarily based in California, but will be spreading out throughout the United States as well.
I have a question that Don led me to. You could, with the tapes, do a lot of this work on your own if you needed to, if you say couldn't.
To me, and please know that I am not in competition. We're all doing our part of this big jigsaw puzzle. So my sense of using the tape is to jumpstart the self.
But the tapes that were on the table over there that would give you that jump start.
Oh, the ones that,
Like healing yourself with your own voice.
Yes, that's that, and then Roar of Silences now has 2 tapes. There's a lot of healing with tone and chant, trying to give the historical, the musical, as well as the practical. It's a little complex. I think that the real training in the future is how to observe listening styles of the other person, not treatment styles to another person. And I think that kind of balances out. I think we've learned a lot in giving. So, but it's coming. I think within 2 years there'll be major course studies that are available on how to develop your own glossary of how you respond.
I'd like to ask Sarajane, since you're a musician, you can play for when you use the table, but what about music, just having music played and using the table?
I use music or CDs occasionally. I can play them through the table. I prefer to use live music because I can really gear it immediately to what's going on with the client. Plus, I like to, as I started playing scales and finding out exactly what tone is resonating in the spot that needs to be released, and I improvise around those tones sometime, and sometimes I'll do some real repetitive notes, play them repetitively, so it's like getting a musical massage, and so I can really control it a lot better. So that's why I prefer live music.
The last piece you put on, Don Campbell put on, was showing rhythms, 3 against 4, perhaps that was sort of polyrhythms were, had their own effect beyond the notes or the keys, for that matter. Are you familiar with anybody doing work more with rhythms? We're talking a lot about sound.
Bach. Literally, Andrew Tracy, I've been to South Africa twice through a couple of the universities, both Black in Botswana as well as at Rhodes, and they're beginning to look at this. A sense that I have is, and this is where I want to work more with my colleagues here, is that the neocortex only measures certain conscious parts of the brain. The most interesting things to me are the extra responses that happen in the limbic system and deep hindbrain function, because they're the ones that modify the body. And I'm not sure, other than systolic blood pressure and other kinds of forms of muscle things, that the mind mapping is giving us indications of what's happening in the emotional center, because the emotional center is not in the right brain. It never has been and never will be. It's way, we're looking at the frontal part of the limbic system and hypothalamus and much more sophisticated things that none of us here are willing to donate them for testing, because we can't get to the testing of that. So I think suddenly we're realizing it's just not what you pour in one ear or in a musical sound experience, that we're responding through, I always call the limbic system the Mr. Coffee. You can put decaf in it, or you can put all sorts of flavors, but it processes the conscious response into an emotion that affects the body's ability to block or unblock.
I'd like to offer a comment from someone I would have loved to have had as a co-panelist, Jeffrey Thompson, who's produced some wonderful psychoacoustic tapes. I interviewed him about sound table technologies for an article I wrote in Megabrain Report, and he made a very interesting comment. He talked about the amount of the of fibers in the spinal column that are devoted to sensing vibration, and it's nearly dominant, over 50%. We're spent a tremendous amount of our deep functions are related to this sensation of vibration. And what Jeffrey was pointing out is that when we deliver vibration so intimately to the body and brain, we're delivering it to the place where we're most deeply wired, these limbic centers that you're talking about. And this is why these sound tables, and in my opinion, particularly the water-based ones, have such a profound effect. It's just like they reach right in and grab us in this very primitive place.
We've been working pretty extensively with therapists, especially in northern Marin County, Northern California, and specifically working with individuals toning with themselves on sound tables, and it's amazing the results that occur. Also very, very intimate, as Terry just spoke. Notice especially when male therapists are working with female clients, there's a real issue of the voice coming right into the body. With issues there, that it's just so very clear how intimate this is in working with the vibrational aspects of your own voice and others' voices. And there needs to be that's why I stress programs and developing programs around this with real clear intention and good quality. But it is very effective and very profound and powerful.
Somebody from the back here.
Yeah, I'm interested in changing the acoustics in the average classroom. People. Not only the acoustics, but also the total sound environment of any classroom. Not a room that would be specifically, say, special ed or anything like that. Just wondering if anybody here had any idea.
Yeah, we have developed, I had a 5-year Guggenheim for Chicago inner city schools where we did a lot of sound testing, took the lowest amount of intelligence, and of course there are a dozen schools that tie for that in South Chicago. And again, this is quite advanced, but one thing that we ended up trying is for the teacher to always move to this side of the classroom so that the right ear gets the auditory framing. And literally, without any amplification, we're teaching teachers how to watch the listening style by the head movement, the attention movement, and that Dr. Lozanov, Georgy Lozanov, has made some interesting uses of music and sound in kind of put certain kinds of Baroque music as the teacher's voice speaks, because number one, I'm hot, I'm tired, my voice goes up if I don't get some air. I use a mic. I have a $200 little mic set that goes with me every time I do a workshop, and it goes to this part of the room, so it's more right ear inclined. After about 15 minutes of knowing how to watch a listening child, you have enough games so you can change their reptiles so they're sitting in different places, so there's not that immense strain on that. In my book, Rhythms of Learning, I think there's a couple of pages just about this that might be helpful.
With regard to that effect on kids, what about the constant barrage of AC/DC, Megadeth, Guns N' Roses at 100 some odd decibels that people are supposed to do? I'd like to get the panel's kind of quick impressions on what's happening sociologically.
Does anybody else have a question?
I would say half the kids in America, if they didn't have football and rock music, there would be massive suicide in this country because we've not provided them with the rituals, the dance of initiation that allows their ear to open. The male voice, until a male voice can easily go into the head tone, his child voice. Males are castrated once at puberty because their voice simply changes and their generative organ of speech and logos in the voice is taken away. And I do not like that kind of music, much less living underneath anybody who has it. But every biological system on the face of this planet does what it needs to do to survive first. That's the deep reptilian hindbrain function. And I think some of the pop music is survival music that for those of us who have eloquently orchestrated prefrontal and limbic safety, that we don't need that. It's an alien to us, and it may be just the shell that allows them to survive in a very chaotic, negative world.
I agree with what was said before about the need to come up with the more clearer terminology, because I think then we can look for the biochemical correlates that that must be around in the mind-body continuum. And I was wondering if you know if research is going on to show that correlation, and if there isn't, why isn't there research going on?
We've basically, in the aspect of sound, I've been doing workshops in sound for a while now, and there's a few people in the area of psychoneuroimmunology who are really interested in this aspect. There's a doctor named Dr. Andrew Weil who has a book, Natural Health, Natural Medicine. When I was in Tucson doing a workshop, who sponsored support of us with chronic fatigue syndrome and taking a look at that and any biochemical changes that occurred after our workshops. And another man named Glenn Heidemann who has a book called Psychoneuroimmunology, something into the future. So briefly, during our workshop experiences and our experiences as we put this technology out there, I'm noticing that there are people who are really interested and are attempting now to get the funding for that, specifically in the field of psychoneuroimmunology.
And where are they getting the funding from?
Well, that's pretty limited. I think that there's a particular researcher who's doing exactly what you're asking about, though, which is Norman Shealy, who's very well known. He's been doing extensive blood tests where he takes a before and after blood sample after a session on a sound table, a before and after blood test after a session on his Sheely Relaxmate with the flashing lights and the goggles, before and after tests after color therapy using the Lumitron. And he's shown very interesting changes in not just neurotransmitter, but also hormonal levels. He particularly likes to watch levels of oxytocin, which is our nurturing. You know, when we feel nurtured, it's about breastfeeding, but the infant, you know, secretes it during breastfeeding, not just the mother. Men have it in their bodies just like women do. And levels of oxytocin go up when we feel nurtured. He also monitors levels of various neurotransmitters, serotonin and so forth. And he's seen that these modalities, and particularly the sound table is one, but also with light, produce very interesting and sharp changes in these levels. But the large-scale statistical study, double-blinded and everything else, really still hasn't taken place. So this is preliminary findings that I'm telling you about. Well, because you haven't given enough money to Dr. Norman Sheely.
Norman also has, if anybody can get to Springfield, I've done his staff training. He has a Baytar, he has 3 or 4 different sound tables, and the whole, it's all a Chinese domes that are 5-sided geodesic domes, and the whole floor is made of crystal, and I mean, and he's Springfield, Missouri, and Norman Sheely. So, I mean, he's really on the cutting edge of learning how to ask these questions, because it's almost impossible to frame a question that we can measure, because we're so complex. And sound is not just localized to one part of the brain. It does too many things.
I might add that the NIH just formed an Office of Alternative Medicine, and they do have a limited amount of grant money. Yeah, limited amount of grant money available, but they are willing to listen to people that have proposals. So.
Well, Clinton's more musical than Reagan.
Has there been any measurements of intention? And I'm not talking only about the role of intention in language, maybe even pre-language intention, and how that affects the rhythms in the body or vibration.
Most studies are designed to eliminate the placebo effect, which is, in a way, a measure of intention. The profundity of the effect of our intention upon experimental results is universally accepted and ignored in the scientific community, such that it isn't really separately measured generally. And you know, it's a good point, I think.
Has any research been done, or out of your clinical experiences with a sound table, with individuals with neurological dysfunction, cerebral palsy, head trauma, Parkinson's, etc.? And what's the effect on...
There's a lot of clinical use of sound tables with people with neurological impairment. But I did an article on this subject and attempted to find the data, and it isn't there yet. There is a lot of wonderful anecdotal clinical results which show effects, but it isn't measured and statistically compiled yet.
What kind of effects are being seen on muscle tone or coordination?
Children who are just clutched in pain suddenly opening up for the first time in their lives sometimes. I mean, wonderful effects, very obvious, moving clinical improvements.
I recently got some information from a new company that's producing some chairs or table recliners called Next Wave in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And with that came the data from a doctor from Finland who's done the clinical research. And he's worked a lot, or the studies anyway that they've done have been with severely disabled children and adults. And the findings were really impressive. And it reduces muscle, the tonic, muscle tone, and also it improves lymphatic circulation. And they work mainly with low-frequency sound, and they found that was the best.
Jeff, do we have any more time? That's not Jeff. We're due at our next workshop in 2.5 minutes.